everybody. Welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and returning to the show, had to roll out all the big guns for this week. Carmen Vitali, FOX Sports NFL reporter. Carmen, we've got a big game to talk about for the Vikings for the first time in a really long time. It feels like, as they have cruised through the AFC South. I want no follow-ups with that. They won the games. Let's never talk about them again. Vikings Bears. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting given the fact that Brian Flores and his defenses have been able to put quarterbacks in a blender, even some experienced quarterbacks in a blender. The only ones that have been able to figure him out somewhat have been Matthew Stafford and Jared Goff so far this season. Caleb Williams is not either of those guys. He does idolize Matthew Stafford, though, but he hasn't seen a lot when it comes to NFL defenses. They're just going through all of these changes in Chicago with Thomas Brown as his new offensive play caller. Things looked a lot better against the Packers. Now, can that continue against a really tough test as far as what he's going to be looking at, what's going to be thrown at him? I fully expect Brian Flores to try and overwhelm this offensive line, though they do have, and they have had now their 2 tackles back, so they're pretty healthy along the offensive line, or at least healthier than they've been for most of the season. I still fully expect that to be a huge trench battle right in front of Caleb Williams. So it's going to be very key to try to get him as much information prior to the snap as you're kind of looking at what Brian Flores likes to do, even though that could change post-snap.
I do wonder about Caleb and how he's going to respond to this Flores defense, because I feel like it's a little bit of a toughness check. Like, how tough are you? Are you willing to stand in there? And Jared Goff did an amazing job of this. Stafford got rid of the ball quickly, but Goff took a bunch of hits in that game, still found his way, made his way through all those pressures. And I think that even if you're a young quarterback that's going to take some hits and struggle, if you fight your way through that, I'm going to be impressed, because I know how difficult it is up front. But I have a bigger philosophical question for you before we get into this game, because I feel like it's so on display here, is when Kevin O'Connell said that quarterbacks don't fail organizations, organizations fail quarterbacks. Like, how much of you believes that, and how much of you goes, I don't know, some quarterbacks just aren't that good?
No, I mean, obviously there are some swings and misses on quarterbacks in this league, but I think what we're seeing more than ever, which Minnesota itself and Sam Darnold with Kevin O'Connell is the shining example of the fact that coaching matters, environment matters. That all needs to align in order for quarterbacks to be good, because they aren't given the runway that perhaps they were 20 years ago, or the runway that they're given in college to really develop. That's not something that, especially if you're taken in the first round with a high pick, you're expected to produce right away. That's not necessarily fair for the toughest position in sports, in all 4 major North American sports. It's the toughest position. It's the most involved. You have to process so much information at speeds that are absolutely insane and quite different from what you just did in college. I think that's what gets lost in all of this, is the college game, while it looks similar when you're watching it, is still drastically different than what these guys are asked to do at the NFL level. And so there is quite a learning curve. Now, some of these guys are put in positions where they're able to ease into the NFL style of play, a la Jaden Daniels in Washington. I think Cliff Kingsbury did a wonderful job of meshing what Jaden was asked to do in college versus what he will be asked to do in the NFL, and really pared that down for the first part of the season. The first 4 weeks of the season, Jaden Daniels, his average depth of target was one of the lowest in the league. It was a very conservative, very basic offense. He wasn't responsible for all of the pre-snap checks and decisions and all that. Like, his offensive line helped him, and we now know how good that offensive line is now that the season has gone on. And then after those first 4 or 5 weeks, you started to see more introduction of the downfield pass. Jaden Daniels was picking his spots. His confidence was up. His understanding of the offense, his rapport with his receivers, all of that had started to come along. And only then did Cliff Kingsbury say, okay, now you can have this part of the playbook, and now we're going to open it up this way. That, to me, is such a good coaching job. That's such a kind of a roadmap to use when you're kind of developing these guys to get their confidence up, because that initial situation matters so much. And I do think that a lot of organizations, whether it's as simple as the coach his teaching philosophies don't align with that quarterback's learning style, or it's a situation like in Chicago, for instance, where Matt Eberflus is coaching for his job. You've now set up this wonderful environment roster wise, but now the expectations are through the roof, and there is absolutely no patience. There is no any sort of really ability to ease this guy in, because he needs to start producing right away as the number 1 overall pick. And if that doesn't align, or you're not given the option to ease him in, you saw it. Shane Waldron gave him the whole playbook right off the bat. All of the responsibilities, all of the pre-snap decisions, all of the protection calls and checks, and all of that was all on Caleb Williams' plate right off the bat, going against defenses that he's never seen before. Was kind of a recipe for disaster. So I'm just hoping now going forward, we're seeing, all right, we're adjusting, we're pulling things back a little bit. We're getting Caleb Williams comfortable again and confident again so that he can actually develop the rest of the year.
There's just a big part of me that thinks it just shouldn't be this hard, right? Like, it's almost like every offensive dude has to prove how much they can make a quarterback do until his head explodes. Meanwhile, Kyle Shanahan's like, run the bootleg again, and they run a play action and somebody's wide open. And I know San Francisco's having a tougher time this year, but that's just been Jimmy Garoppolo operating it, Brock Purdy, and keeps hacking the system. And even last year with Bobby Slowick and the way that he handled CJ Stroud when they could block a little better, they still ran a lot of bootlegs and a lot of the things off of that made life pretty easy for CJ Stroud at times. And I think that's what Kevin O'Connell is battling with. It's like the angel and the devil on Kevin O'Connell's shoulder here, because you know that he wants to run every single thing he's ever thought of his whole life for Justin Jefferson, but he also knows that he can't. And about halfway through, and really after that Rams game, it felt like he made an adjustment to where they haven't scored as many points, but they've had the ball forever, and their success rate is really high, and their first downs are really high. And that to me was Kevin O'Connell saying to himself, I can't just ask Darnold to be back there being Kirk Cousins, who was 34 years old and had all those years of starting. I've got to pare it down. And it's been really effective the last couple of weeks. I mean, I know the interceptions with Jaguars game, but holding onto the ball, long drives, and then really good bounce back against Tennessee. I think that's been the key to this thing sustaining some success.
Yeah. And again, that's also just kind of, that's all part of the development process too. I mean, this is also, it's not even just the quarterbacks they're developing, it's their play callers. It's how can they adjust and figure out what their guys do well, and then what can they do with that? It's all this whole puzzle piece that all has to go together. And when you're talking about a head coach who is also the offensive play caller, it's all right, as a head coach, he has all of the logistical decisions to go through. I think that's been like my talking point this week, is just basically about what head coaches have to do on top of the X's and O's and the on-field part, and how that impacts the situation that these guys are in, and how well that they can develop. And again, how much the organization trusts them and all that kind of stuff. Like, you have to make every little decision when you're the head coach, whether that's the meal that y'all are going to have when you take off on the road, and what's going to be on the plane, what's waiting for you at the hotel. It's what hotels are you staying in, and when are you getting out to certain places, and you're consulting with the guys that you hired in the sports science side of things, the training side of things, like when you have longer road trips and this, that, the other, like all of this stuff comes along with being a head coach. And sometimes it can spread you a little thin. So I think that there's that you have to kind of like think about that when it comes to, all right, this head coach is also learning himself what he needs to do in order to be successful and to help his players along. And that doesn't just concern what's on the field. It's an all-encompassing, very holistic thing when you're talking about being the head coach and play caller.
And I think Kevin O'Connell has made this all look a little bit on the easy side from all the things you just talked about, right?
First head coaching job. It's his first head coaching job in Minnesota, and he's done it seamlessly.
Friends, gifting is hard, but here's a hint. Give the gift of connection from US Cellular. Not sure what that means? Here's a slightly more specific hint. You could choose 4 free phones and get 4 lines for $90 a month from US Cellular. Your family wants new phones? How do we know? They told us. The good news is that compared to wrapping presents, you're great at taking hints. So take a hint and get 4 free phones and 4 lines for $90 a month. US Cellular, built for us. Ready to kick off some extra fun on football Sundays? Grab Catan and keep the action going off the field. While Minnesota's football teams are crushing it, you and your crew can build, trade, and outsmart each other in the ultimate game of strategy. Whether it's during halftime or between big plays, Catan brings a whole new level of competition and excitement to your game day. Visit CatanShop.com and use the coupon code PURPLE to get a 10% discount off Catan for a limited time. Again, CatanShop.com, coupon code PURPLE to get a 10% discount on Catan for a limited time only. I mean, I think it goes to maybe him being a player and understanding that perspective, because when I talk to players about why they grade O'Connell so high in those NFL PA things that we get everybody's dirt through, but they also grade the Vikings repeatedly high. One of the things they say is the scheduling's really good for us, because O'Connell, you have to make out the schedule. You're a middle manager in a lot of ways. And it seems like Matt Eberflus has never really understood that. He's never understood the culture part of it, and also finding the right person for Caleb Williams. And we know this from Mike Zimmer. You also can't just say, all right, you got the offense, why don't you worry about that, and I'll take on the defense. It has to be, I dare I say, collaborative effort. But the defensive guy also has to understand what's going on the offensive side, not be many weeks late to make a reaction. And then you have to fire the guy because you have no other option, where you should have been ahead of that much earlier in the season.
Yeah, and that's where we kind of see Matt Eberflus, I think a lot of these coaches fall into the trap of being loyal to a fault, where you don't want to give up on your guy. And also, I mean, this was the second offensive coordinator that Matt Eberflus had to fire within a calendar year. That doesn't look good for you, because, again, as the head coach, you are tasked with bringing along a staff that is going to allow you to be successful. What I have found interesting this year, too, is Matt Eberflus, though he's the defensive play caller, though he's a defensive-minded head coach, we've heard Caleb Williams talk about how, and Matt Eberflus himself talk about how they have a meeting every day. That's not very characteristic or normal when it comes to defensive head coaches. Having talked to some around the league, every time I hear how involved Matt Eberflus has been on the offensive side of things, it's more and more apparent that he's doing these things because he knows that he's coaching for his job, and that he needs to make sure that he's kind of having to be forced into being a micromanager, which I also think kind of creates some tensions here and there, where now you're really spreading yourself too thin, because all of those other decisions I just talked about that have nothing to do with what happens on the field are on his plate. The defense is on his plate. The defensive play calling and game plan is on his plate. You're going to add quarterback development onto that as a defensive guy. That's spreading yourself entirely too thin. And again, not a normal thing for a defensive head coach to be that involved. And then it still took you that long to make a change at play caller, because you thought, well, all right, maybe you just really had that much faith in Caleb Williams to be able to overcome all of this, but you need to help him out a little bit again. There's so much disconnect in Chicago right now as far as like organizationally. They have a very interesting structure when it comes to the team president being over football, which isn't always the case. Usually it's the GM that kind of has absolute authority over football decisions. And then you've got ownership that is involved, although they say they're not involved, but we all know that that's not usually the case. And that, if ownership is in these weekly meetings with the GM, with the president, with the head coach, you better believe that they're involved. So it's all of these voices, and it's resulted in something that's not streamlined at all. I think that is more of the overarching issue in Chicago, is that, it's not that the organization is cursed and can't get offensive players or quarterbacks. It's that their process is flawed, and there's a common denominator there that's been there the whole time that you think, okay, that's probably has more to do with this than anything. And until you rectify that situation, whether that is, I'm not thinking that the McCaskies are going to sell the team because they're a legacy franchise, they're the charter franchise, that family has been in control of this franchise forever. But do you maybe take a different approach? And that's what I think we all thought Kevin Warren was going to be, all that kind of stuff. I mean, this is all so far away from what happens on the field, but it affects it so greatly.
The answer just seems like it was so much right there in front of them to change coaches and then pair a new coach with Caleb Williams and tie those two
I know.
together going forward. And
I
to
know.
miss that is just wild to me. And it's not like they had success. It's not like they won 11 games and then, well, okay, we can't fire him now. They won 7.
Right.
And one of them I saw, Josh Dobbs, throw 4 interceptions. I can't say it was a mind-blowing victory for the Chicago Bears. And they, had some lucky scheduling as well. That is what's odd to me. And I guess I wonder how much you think they are failing Caleb Williams. How much does this set him back? And also maybe how much did this reveal some shortcomings about him? Because I also think I've seen some other quarterbacks go into some really bad situations and be able to push through. It doesn't seem like the Bengals have the best organization, for example, and Burrow found his way through that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that there are things that you can point to as well with Cincinnati. I think I really like Zach Taylor as a coach. I think you have Lou Anarumo as the defensive coordinator, which this year is not a great example of that. But I do think that in the past, that's been a unit that you can rely on. There are little bits and pieces, and you got lucky with getting Jamar Chase then, who Joe Burrow is super familiar with, and he gets to come along for the ride. And then you had, at least last year, you had a really good run game. The last couple of years, really, in Cincinnati, you had a really good run game to lean on as well. There were things that on the field still helped Joe Burrow. And that's not to take anything away from Joey B. I absolutely adore him. I think he's one of my favorite players in the league. I do think, though, that Caleb Williams coming in was expected to have such a short learning curve because he was the first overall pick and he was so talented. I was very intentional about not calling him generational because I don't think that's fair to place on somebody who's never played an NFL snap. He was one of the most highly touted prospects in the last few years. That much is true. But again, there's a disconnect between what he was asked to do in college and then what he can get away with in the NFL. And you saw him in the first couple games realize that. And I do think that Caleb Williams has a very special quality to him to be able to fight through things. And that's why I do still think that this can be different for him. And it's not because the organization has done anything differently. I do think it's because Caleb Williams is different. And you see that over and over again. And you've seen it this season where even in that Washington game, the Fail Mary game, 3 quarters were absolutely dismal. Awful. Caleb Williams did not get anything going. He looked terrible. He was taking forever to make decisions. The offensive line wasn't helping him out. They had no run game to speak of, all of these things. And then the fourth quarter comes around. And somehow Caleb Williams pushes through, has a nearly perfect quarter, and gets the Bears with a lead with 25 seconds left in the game. If it's not for that prayer and the miracle of that Hail Mary and things going wrong and his head coach making some questionable decisions about not taking a timeout beforehand, not pressuring beforehand, not making sure all of his players were paying attention to the play, then we're talking about a win there. And the trajectory after that probably looks a lot better. And then again, this last game against Green Bay, you stop Green Bay, you have them turn it over on downs after that 60-yard play by Christian Watson, and you go down the field again. You make that crucial stop. Green Bay goes back, and then they score. Perfect. You've got the literal quintessential 2-minute drill. You need just a field goal to win. Caleb Williams goes out. He gets sacked twice on start that drive. And then on 3rd and 19, hits Rome Odunze, your other top 10 pick. And then on 4th and 3, hits Rome Odunze again. Gets you to exactly where you need to be as far as the range of Cairo Santos. And again, it's not Caleb Williams that's failing to get these wins, because then you don't take the time to maybe at least get the ball on the hash that Cairo Santos normally kicks from. You don't take the time. These are not issues from Caleb Williams. So you see the direct kind of effect that organizational dysfunction is having on Caleb. But the flip side of this and the silver lining of all of this is that you're also seeing Caleb Williams fight through it anyway and come out the other side. And so that you do think that if these organizational failings not only not necessarily even stop, but if you do kind of get someone a little bit more competent making these decisions, that maybe this really does turn around for Caleb Williams, for the organization. if anybody can survive a first-year head coach or his first head coach being fired and getting another coach in there for his second year, I do think it's Caleb Williams, just given what we've seen already this season.
And the important thing is that he's going to have weapons. He's going to
Yes.
have things to work with in the future. And I do agree that Ryan Poles has done a good job of building the roster. It was just some loyalty to his first head coach hiring. And we saw that here with O'Connell, maybe a little too much loyalty in 2022 to Ed Donatel that cost them in the playoffs. So that's a tough lesson to learn. But I just think it's way too early to start calling anything on Caleb Williams. That's just the world we live in.
Right.
Not that Fox Sports is responsible at all for any of this, but reactionary.
Get me in trouble, Matt.
I want to get your sizing up of the NFC race and where you think the Vikings fit into this. I would not blame you if you didn't rewatch and grind the tape of Vikings Jags. I hope they burned that tape and no one's ever watched it again. But Sam Darnold continues overall to have top 12 type of quarterback play. The defense remains at the top of the league. They have a much tougher schedule going to the next month. Right. Where do you place them? Everyone's got the Lions at the top. Where do you place them behind that?
Yeah, I really do think that this is sustainable given the fact that it goes back to something that I talked about a lot prior to the season even starting, which was Sam Darnold doesn't need to go out there and be a world beater with the talent that's on this team. And the fact that you have a defensive side of the ball that you can really rely on to limit the amount of points. Some of these last couple of wins against these AFC South teams have been tough. They haven't been easy to watch, but the Vikings are coming out on the right side of it and they're fighting through certain things. And again, it's really that the offense hasn't scored as many points as you need them to, but the defense has limited the points to where you're still winning these games anyway. So I really do think that that is a recipe for success when you're talking about going up against the better teams. Now, I'm not picking anybody over the Lions. I am not picking the Vikings to win over the Lions. There's the second time around, or have they played them yet?
They've played them once, lost by 2 points.
That's right. That was the 2-point game. And then, I get confused with the Green Bay and then how that, anyway. I do expect the Lions to by far and away be the top seed in the NFC. I think they're the best team in the league right now. I think that the Vikings are I really do still believe that there are 3 playoff teams that are coming out of this division. And I believe that the Minnesota Vikings are one of them. So I have to think that whether that's, they're the first wild card seed, the second wild card seed, I don't really know, but I really expect the Vikings to get into the playoffs. And I really think that they have a shot to at least win one game again, given the fact that they're so capable of playing complementary football and you're not putting this all on Sam Darnold's shoulders. They're a very well-coached team. We just talked at length about how good Kevin O'Connell is. I try to talk at length about how good Kevin O'Connell is pretty much any chance I get because I don't think enough people are talking enough about how he is a true coach of the year candidate. He should be, especially if you take into account what happened last season after Kirk Cousins went down. I mean, over and over again, we're seeing just how well he is coaching this team. And if they do win a playoff game, I think that that's a real conversation that we need to have about how I think coach of the year is coming out of this division. Kevin O'Connell just happens to have some competition when it comes to Matt LaFleur and what he was able to do in Jordan Love's absence, on top of obviously Dan Campbell, who may be one of those CEO head coaches, but he's probably the best at it in the league right now.
Would you change your take on the Vikings if they do not win this game? Because I think a lot of people will, as far as them being a contender.
Yeah, probably. Honestly, I don't know that I would change that they would get into the playoffs. I still think that that's not necessarily a lock, but I really think that even down the stretch, you're going to have that's going to happen. But I don't know that I trust them as much to win a game in the playoffs when the competition gets up there. It's going to be interesting to see how much Thomas Brown is able to evolve because you have such a limited sample size on that. And I think a lot of people are talking about, well, now you know what he looks like as the Bears play caller. Do you though? Because when you're doing film study of a team getting in advance of playing them, it's usually at least a 4-game sample size that you're looking at because that's when you can pick up on tendencies. That's when you can pick up on certain things. you can't do that yet with the Bears under Thomas Brown, or the Bears offense under Thomas Brown. So I do still think that there's probably stuff that we haven't seen out of the Chicago Bears offense that's going to be shown against the Minnesota Vikings, but I also do trust these play callers to kind of adjust. And whether that means Minnesota maybe gets off to a slow start, kicks in the second half, I think that's a very real possibility. I think I would pick the Bears to cover, but
it's never easy.
It's never easy.
Never, absolutely never in the NFC North, but especially when the Vikings go to Soldier Field. Carmen Vitali, great to have you back on the show, but you just came out throwing heat today. I appreciate that. I'm glad that we could make a little bit of time to talk, and we'll absolutely do it again because there's a lot more NFC North upon us.
There is. This is all so backloaded. I'm like, oh, okay. This is like when the real season's starting now.
That's how it feels. It feels like we just had a preseason in the middle of the year for the Vikings, and now it's time to go. So Fox Sports is where you find you. Never controversial or reactionary on there. Always just great reporting from you. No, I'm just kidding.
Me in particular.
From you, though, truly one of my favorites. But I appreciate you taking the time, and we'll definitely do it soon.